Welcome to the Collective Talk podcast, where we share reflections on prayer, family, and ministry. On today's episode, we'll be talking all about church planning, and I have one of my favorite guests on the show who happens to be my husband, Mark Francey. Can you help me welcome Mark Francey on the show?
I better be your favorite.
You
Yes.
are, but you do.
You
yes.
said one of my favorites.
Well, because my dad was one of them.
I feel like Dad's here. I got to be still like somewhere.
You are. You definitely are. So I'm so excited today. On the show today, we're going to be talking about church planning, which I feel like I don't know if we are experts quite yet, but we did it. We did church planning, and so we planted a church, kind of parachuted here to Orange County, California from Idaho, land of the potatoes. And so we came here, started a church. And so if for those that are maybe listening or tuning in, can you explain basically what church planning is? Maybe that's a new concept to them. Can you explain what church planning is?
Well, I think even when I used to hear the phrase church planning, I thought, man, is there some sort of tree that we're going to plant somewhere in the building? I always thought maybe it's some sort of shrub or I don't know, church plant. But yeah, church planning is essentially like starting a company, a startup company. Being a church planter would kind of be like being a founder, maybe a similarity to that. But we started our church in 2018, and we did parachute in. That's just a terminology that means that we didn't live close to where we were starting the church. We moved about 800 miles from where we were in Boise, Idaho, where everybody was moving to from California. Yes. Everyone still thinks we're crazy for moving here.
Yeah, in fact, didn't we get emails and people, as soon as we came in, they're like, why are you moving to California? Everybody's moving out. Why are you moving here? And we're like, wow, that's a great greeting.
Yeah,
to
we had
California.
some of the Frozen Chosen not happy that we were moving in. The fact that we believe that God can use women and you wear makeup. I mean, all that stuff offended some of those people. But we got some of those emails, and we're just thinking, there's more people within a 30-mile radius of where we live now than the entire state of Idaho. And so we knew that obviously the harvest field was ripe here. We didn't want to come back to California. We'll talk some of that story. I'm from California. I thought Idaho was my promised land. And so I moved to Idaho in 2002 after I graduated. I grew up in Lancaster in Palm Hill. I'm kidding, Palmdale, Lancaster. But yeah, I had no idea that we would ever move back here. But yeah, we started the church in September of 2018. It's been a wild ride.
Yeah, that's crazy. So what were, how did God speak to us? Just the journey. Can you share with the listeners like just our journey and how God spoke to us to start the church and all of that?
Well, we got married in 2005. You are obviously a pastor's daughter.
Yes.
You've seen it all. Your parents started a church from Portland, Oregon to Boise, Idaho. You saw all the headache, all the difficulties they went through. So we got married in 2005. I have heritage. My grandma was a missionary. She was, mentored by Amy Semple McPherson, and she started the first Foursquare churches in Japan, in China with my grandpa. And so my dad was born as a missionary kid, kind of skipped a generation. So I came into walking with God almost like a first generation Christian in that regard. So we got married in 2005, and you said, Mark, there's two things we never want to do. We never want to start a church, and we never want to be lead pastors.
Yes.
My parents did that. It's not fun. It's tricky. It's challenging. It's ugly at times. We don't want to do that. Let's just serve our parents, and then when your brother takes over the church, we'll come and serve him and his wife, and you can maybe do some itinerant ministry. You had a successful business. We were living our best life. So that sounded great. We got married in 2005. 3 years later, I was reading a book, ironically, by Pastor Rick Warren, the great Pastor Rick Warren, how he, not his purpose-driven life, but his purpose-driven church. He told the story of how he started Saddleback Church. And I remember reading this book, and I'm like crying. I'm not even an emotional person. I'm crying reading this book like, we're going to do this one day.
Yeah.
So I remember yelling, hey, Rachelle, come here, and like reading this book in the bathtub or something. And I'm like, you got to read this book. I think we're going to start a church. And you're like, we talked about that, Mark. We're not doing that. And I'm like, you got to read this book. She's like, I've read it. I'm like, read it again.
Yeah.
So you started reading it, and the same tug of heaven started hitting your heart. And I remember our church in Idaho is phenomenal, healthy. I've only been, kind of my claim to fame is I've only been in 2 churches my whole life.
Yes.
It's been Capital Church for 17 years and Oceans Church now for 5. But I remember the one thing of our church is I'd never really seen someone transition out of a leadership role in our church in Idaho to do another church in a healthy way. It was always, kind of divisive, or people were disgruntled, or whatever it was. Just usually that launched wasn't peaceful. And so the idea of leaving to start a church felt like treason in a sense. Just that wasn't our normal there. And I didn't want to ruin our family. You didn't want to ruin your family. So we'd never seen leaving to start something healthy modeled. So basically we prayed and we said, God, we don't want to mess our family up. We're spending the holidays together. We love each other. If you want us to start a church, we will. And I think it was a pretty smart prayer that we prayed. We were young marrieds.
Yeah.
It was like a Tom Brady contract. But I remember going, God, if you want us to start a church, we'll go anywhere in the world under one condition. Your parents, our pastors, have to initiate the conversation that they feel like we're supposed to go somewhere to start a church. If your parents tell us that, hey, we feel like you're supposed to do something or bring it up to us, we'll go anywhere in the world. But if they don't initiate the conversation, we will never bring it up to them.
Right.
And we will be in obedience, serving you. And so I remember we prayed that prayer in 2008. It was like a year and a half later that your parents were at a pastor's conference. A bunch of great leaders from the body of Christ from all over the world were there. And a very prayerful, prophetic lady by the name of Cindy Jacobs was at a dinner table with mom and dad. And she had been to our church once or twice, actually prayed for me when I was like 18 out of a big crowd, called me out, prayed stuff I'm doing now over me, called you out.
Yes.
And I remember she even, every time she'd pray, and all the people that come through our church would be like, this girl, is that your daughter? Yeah, she's going to influence Hollywood and in California and those industries.
Yeah.
So we got these words like early 2000s.
Yeah.
Now it's 2010. Mom and dad are at this conference sitting at a table with Cindy. Yeah. They knew her, but not well. And Cindy basically said, how many kids do you guys have again, Ken and Connie? And mom and dad were like, we have 3 kids. We got our oldest son's going to take over our church. Our youngest daughter at the time was in D.C.
Yeah.
Middle daughter's amazing, married to the greatest human being. She said something. Maybe that might not
really?
be true, but no, she goes, how many? And so she said, mom and dad walked through that, and she said that your son-in-law, he's not from Idaho. God told me your son-in-law, he's from somewhere else. And they were like, yeah, he's from Southern California. And Cindy, I guess, pointed at him and said, God spoke to me. They're church planners. They're going to move back to Southern California. Yeah. And they're going to start a movement. It's going to impact the world. And I remember mom and dad called us that night, said, we got to talk to you when we come home. Yeah. As soon as they came home and started the conversation, we started crying.
Yes. Yeah, because we thought we had an out. We thought, oh, yeah, nobody's going to...
We're going to have grandkids. They're not going to ask us to leave.
Yeah, they don't want us to leave. And then, obviously, the Lord spoke to Cindy Jacobs. And you know what? I recently just asked her. I saw her at in Sacramento. And I asked her, hey, do you remember that word that you gave to me and Mark? And she's like, I did. That is one of the words that I do remember.
Wow.
And so I thought that was pretty amazing that she still remembered it because she gives out so many words. But that's such an important part of our story. Yeah. And just an incredible overview. And that's kind of how we thought of California. And then we moved here. Before we moved here, we actually did a prayer drive.
We started doing vacations down here around that time.
Yeah, right.
And your business was doing good. Yes. I was traveling. And we found, I lived in California for 18 years. I never been to Orange County. Yeah. And it wasn't until we have our first daughter, 2008, we do a vacation, stay in Dana Point, fall in love with it. But I always thought you can't move somewhere you actually like
vacation
to start a church. Yeah. Like you got to suffer. Like my grandparents were missionaries. Like I made fun of all my friends that started churches in nice places. Like the Palm Beach calling must be nice, you know.
Well, didn't God speak to you at a youth conference back in the day?
Yeah, that God had to really soften our hearts because I was always like, we got to do something like we're gonna be missionaries
to China, Japan.
We're gonna do something crazy. Yeah. And I remember when I got called to ministry, I was 19 years old. It was a year after I got saved. I was in Portland, Oregon at a conference called Generation Unleashed. And I remember going to the altar call. And when I was a little kid, one of my earliest memories was in my grandparents' living room. And my grandma would always tell us these missionary stories, doing laundry in the rice paddies, seeing poisonous snakes, just crazy stuff. And I remember she was telling stories one day. I remember walking like I was going to go to the bathroom. And in front of her linen closet, I could still kind of smell it. I heard this voice. I was probably 4 or 5 years old. And the voice was saying something like, will you be a missionary one day too for me? And I had no idea it was the voice of God. I was a little kid. I'm like, yeah, I'd be a missionary. So I remember that was that. Didn't think about that memory for almost 15 years. Now I'm 19 years old. I'm in Portland, Oregon. I respond to the altar call, and I'll never forget, I hadn't thought about that 15 years. God brought me back to that memory when I was 4. And I didn't know that was the first time I heard the voice of God. And he said, Mark, I asked you when you were 4 years old if you'll be a missionary. And I remember just going, oh my gosh, I forgot about that. I start crying because I could smell my grandpa's linen closet. Remember her telling me the stories. It was weird. And he goes, do you still stand by that statement? Will you be a missionary? And I just remember crying. I go, God, I'll go anywhere you want me to go. And then I saw almost like a globe, like on a teacher's desk, start spinning. And I almost felt like God was going to give me my marching orders of where I'm going to go one day. And I just remember he pointed, spun, and like the hand of God stopped the globe. And I heard him say something along the lines, kind of paraphrasing, I'm going to call you to one of the hardest mission fields of your generation. I'm going to call you to people that have everything, that don't think they need me. And he pointed at America. And he said, and if you can reach America, you'll reach the nations of the earth. I didn't know where in America. So I always thought we had to go to some crazy city that we'd break through. And we actually liked Orange County. So fast forward, it's 2008, we discover Orange County. We start going on vacations. That word from Cindy's 2010. And then I start traveling, speaking at all these conferences. And I remember I went to San Diego probably like a month after Cindy prayed that over us and gave us that. And I was in San Diego. The pastor's wife had never heard me speak before. I speak that night at their camp, their church. And I remember she walks up to me after the service. She goes, Mark, I've never heard you speak before, but when you were speaking, I've never had this happen. I had like a vision. You were in this big room. It was beautiful. I think it might have been your church. Behind you, there was a banner that said Orange County. Does that mean anything to you? And that was the first word that we got about Orange County. I thought, dear Lord, like, would you let us live somewhere that we actually like to live? And that was the part of God kind of whittling down that maybe reservation that we had about moving here.
So we would vacation here. We would come here a lot. And then I actually, when I first knew that we were going to live in California, I thought in my head, I thought, oh, maybe it's LA. Then we did a prayer drive with our daughter was it from LA to San Diego?
I think we started right around Santa Barbara.
Santa Barbara area.
Like up by West, we had friends in Westlake. And Calabasas area. We stayed with them. And then we drove from their house, went all the way into LA. Prayer drove LA. My family's all from Pasadena, Eagle Rock. So we prayer drove all that and then kept coming down, and we basically just drove down the PCH and got to Laguna Beach, and South Laguna Beach, right by Salt Creek Beach. There's a restaurant there called the Salt Creek Restaurant, I think. And it was just like Kenzie was probably 4 years old, sleeping in the back seat, and we were praying, had our worship music on, and it was like the presence of God just came in the car so thick. And I remember it was like a balloon popped in both of us at the exact same time. It was so weird. And we just started weeping. I remember pulling over, probably 45 minutes, we were just sobbing. And it felt like, when I tell people, it felt like somebody kidnapped your children. And that urgency, that desperation to find them and to bring them home is what we're feeling. And it was like God gave us his heart for the people of Orange County. It was like one of our mentors says, when you love the people of the city that you pastor in so much that you're ready to buy your cemetery plot there and ready to spend the rest of your life there, that's when you know you're called to that city.
So good.
And that's what I felt like that day. I felt like, God, you gave me your heart for Orange County. These people live in mansions. They have everything on the outside, but they're spiritually bankrupt. And they have it all outside, but the inside they have nothing because they don't have you. And I felt like I was like, Mark, they're lost. They've been stolen.
Yeah.
I want you to bring them home. And so we knew then, that was 2000, I think 12 or right around 2012 that we did that. I think it was like August of 2012, a year to the day.
Yes.
I'm in bed. Kenzie's probably 5 or 6 years, probably 5 years old, 6 years old, something like that. And I remember putting her to sleep that night. And she goes, Daddy, why did you move to Idaho?
Yeah.
And I said, well, Jesus told Daddy to leave California and move to Idaho. And then she asked me, how do you know when you hear Jesus' voice? And I said, well, oh man, how do you, it's a 5-year-old answer, this big theological question. And I remember telling her something like, well, you'll get ideas and thoughts that you normally don't think about. Some of them are scary. But if you know you do it, there's a peace that comes with it. And she's like, okay, kind of nods. We're laying in bed, and all of a sudden she sits up, and she goes, Daddy, her eyes got this big. She said, Jesus is telling me that we're going to move back to California. We're going to start a church, or we're going to do a church in California. And she starts panicking. Yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, because we never said anything.
No.
Ever. Like, we didn't tell Kenzie we were moving until like 4 months before we moved. So we'd gone on vacations knowing that maybe we will live down here one day after some of those things, but never said a word to Kenzie.
Yeah.
So she's 5 years old. She leans up, Daddy, we're going to move. Jesus is telling me we're moving to California. And then it was like the reality of that statement hit it. And she goes, what about Papa? What about Grammy? Like, what about my cousins? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I wasn't ready for this conversation at 9:30 tonight, you know? And I just go, it's okay. Knowing what Jesus wants you to do is only half the battle.
Yes.
It's only half of it, Kenzie. His timing is the other half.
Yeah.
And maybe we will move there one day. Jesus will determine the timing. It's not anytime soon.
So good.
She went to sleep. And then I had a vivid dream a year to the date of that. And that was the dream that God gave me the name of our church, Oceans Church, and all the other details that everyone hears about all the time.
Well, I think that's an incredible overview. And I think it's so important when people are church planning that, we went to ARC, and it actually helps church planners and just to understand how to start a church, startup church. And they give you so many incredible details of what to do, what not to do. And if you are a church planner or you're going to start a church or you're praying about starting a church, ARC is incredible. Mark and I went through that whole process.
Shout out Pastor Dino Rizzo. We love you.
Yes. And it literally helped us so much to be successful in planning our church here in California. But I want to say along with that, I think we've talked to a lot of church planners, and a lot of them, they'll tell us, we think this is a good place to move to. Or, I think that we're going to go, they haven't made up their mind yet. And I asked them, well, have you prayed about it? Like, where is God calling you to? And so I think that's an important question to first start with is where is God calling you to? And who are the people God is calling you to? And I think that's one thing that is super important as a church planner is making sure you're full of prayer and you know exactly where God is calling you to. Good. And a lot of people that we met, it shocked me. I'm like, wait, you're in ministry? You've done church or you've been in ministry for a long time, and you're just thinking it's a good idea to move to Florida, but you don't know if that's where God's called you to. And so we prayed for so many years, and we did prayer drives. We wanted to make sure this is where God called us. So it wasn't just a flippant idea or a thought, but it was something that we knew that God was calling us into and where he was calling us to and the people that God wanted us to reach. And so I think that's an important question in church planning. But diving a little deeper in the topic of church planning, I wonder if we could talk about a little bit of this is a funny one. We basically started our church right before COVID, which was
great timing.
It was insane. So church planning in and of itself is hard work, but right before COVID, let me tell you, it was Like, how do you explain church planning as it is? Like,
well, I think our story was like the, the footage of the skier that's outrunning the avalanche.
Yeah.
It's like, let's not die today with this avalanche. But yeah, it was wild. I mean, COVID was hard enough to navigate for everybody in ministry. You were going to be too liberal for some people, too conservative for other people. So you couldn't really make any friends. It was like you had people leaving because of too many masks, and you had people leaving because there was no mask and everything in between. And so it was a wild window.
Yeah.
And I just remember we kind of took more of an aggressive stance of when the strip bars, the alcohol, liquor stores, when all those things started opening up, I'm like, look, if they're open, we're open. Like that's just, I don't care if Gavin Newsom, what he's saying, we're going to be open. And we caught some flack for that, but I think ultimately we're going to give an account to God one day. And I knew more people that were dying of suicide, drug overdoses, people that were getting divorced than I knew people that were dying of COVID. So for us personally, where we were, our context, our setting, I know this isn't everyone's story.
Right.
We kind of took more of an aggressive stance. So we bought a tent, threw up in a parking lot, started doing church out in the parking lot. And that was really when our church began to erupt. You're probably about a year old, not even maybe a year and some change when COVID hit.
Yeah.
And probably running about 400 or 500 people. And then we put the tents up and it just started really, that was when it really started to multiply.
Yeah.
Kind of going back to what you're saying, I think too many people make it easy for God to send them to a city to start a church. I think this is going to be the biggest thing that you do with your life. You're going to change your whole family's future, your kids. That was one of the things for us is we're like, if the purpose of life is to have a nice house, live in your dream neighborhood, live close to all your family, love the people you work with, we already have the dream life. Like we love where we're at in Idaho. We just built our dream house on a golf course, had just crazy favor in Idaho, led a great youth ministry revival, and we're laying in bed one night going like, why would we want to leave this to live in some apartment in California, spend 6 times the amount of money in rent, and have no guarantee that this goes well? And I think at the end of the day, we got to figure out, is the purpose of life comfort, convenience? Is the purpose of life to just be close to your family, live in your dream house? I mean, our neighbors are like pilots and doctors and attorneys. Like, God gave us this crazy house. And all these things that people want in life, we had. And I remember we laid in bed like, what is the purpose of life?
Yeah.
But if God's purpose is, I gave you gifts, I gave you talents, there's certain people that you can reach and I can reach that no one else can.
Yeah.
And if you don't use that grace, that gift for me, and you just play it safe, we're basically going to be a bad steward of these resources that God's given us.
Yes.
And I felt like God made you for California. I think he's made me for California. The people that are in Orange County, people always would say, like, what are you doing in Idaho? They look at you, they're like, you don't dress like your style, your personality, the stuff that you're interested in. And we always kind of, in some ways, felt like, man, is this our home? Like, do we belong here? We got to Orange County, like, everyone kind of looks like us here. Everyone kind of talks like us here. And it was like God, I think you use different types of bait to reach different types of people. And I think that, a lot of times as a pastor, the easiest demographic to reach is the people that you're like.
Right.
So for us moving here, I think that was a big deal for us, kind of navigating that. On that vein, I was thinking, so many times we make it easy for God to just, hey, I'm going to move 2 miles down the street. I'm going to start another church. I'm not really happy where I'm at. I want to have power. I want to have leadership opportunities. And I would encourage anybody, if you make it easy for God to leave, start a church in your own city, not disrupt your lifestyle, your kids' lifestyle, your family, and you're just doing it out of convenience, I don't think you're a church planner. I think you're a church pirate. Oh. And I think that God ultimately is a God of multiplication. He's not a God of division. And if it's going to divide where you're at to bless where you're going, I would say God's not into it.
Wow.
So for us, this is what I would say. Some of the best advice I would give to church planners now would be, you don't need a lot of people to start a church with. You need the right people.
So good.
There's a big difference between baggage and horsepower. Some people that go with you to start a church are baggage because they're homesick, because they're not called to where you're moving to. They don't have friends. They can't get a job. They don't have any influence in that region. And you're basically babysitting people that are homesick because you enlisted people that weren't called to where you're called.
Yes.
So I would say don't worry about getting a big crowd of people because a lot of the studies say that the people that move with you, if they're not called by God, they're going to be with you for 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, 12 months. They're going to be a pain in your rear end, and then they're going to move back, and you're going to waste hours of your life trying to talk someone into staying somewhere God didn't call them. So One, as I would say,
good.
you don't need a lot of people. You need the right people. So your brother was brilliant. He said, Mark, pray through who you feel like is supposed to go with you. We had a list of 15 people on it. Out of those 15, 8 would move pretty much out of the gate.
Yeah.
The other 12 would move down the road. And then 13, I think out of the 15, only 2 of them didn't move down here. And so, yeah, that was kind of our story is we had horsepower because everyone that came, we said, look, and this is probably the best advice that we were ever given, is someone told me as the church grows when you move, the people that went with you, that sold their houses, left their lives, left their careers to go with you to start the church, you're going to feel obligated to reward them because they were willing to sacrifice everything with you to go after the vision God gave you.
Right.
And one of my buddies said, Mark, you're going to be tempted when the time comes when you can start hiring people to hire those that were loyal to you first out of a favor going, you were loyal to me, I want to be loyal to you.
Right.
And he said, I did that. I hired the people that moved with me, even though they weren't the best candidates.
Yeah.
They weren't the most trained. They weren't the most fit person for the job. I hired out of loyalty, not out of you're the most competent person for the job.
Yeah.
And it hurt our church. So remember, one of the guys told me that, and I told all those 8 people that moved with us, I said, guys, I love all of you. I'm going to be forever, like Toy Story. I'm eternally grateful. You saved our lives. I'm going to be so grateful to you. But I want to tell you something. When we had the chance to hire people, you need to make sure that you're the smartest person, the most qualified person, because I'm not going to hire you out of loyalty. I'm going to hire you because you're the best.
Yeah.
I think kind of lit a fire under those 8 people because I think out of the 8, I think probably 6 or 7 are. One of them is in the studio right now with us. And so, God did it.
That's awesome. Well, that's so beautiful. It's so great talking about it. We've lived through church planning, but just rehearsing what God has done is just so incredible. And so after COVID, we grew through that. And then, but like you were talking about, it's truly just listening to God, hearing a word from God, praying about where you want to go. But I loved what you were talking about is not being comfortable. Has God called us to live comfortable, or has he called us to live dangerous? Yeah. I think so many Christians live a safe life, and we forgot what it's like to take risks for God, to be obedient. We never know what's on the other side of our obedience. Yeah. And so I just want to challenge, church planners to really take the risk for God, pray and ask God, what is the purpose of my life? Is it to live a comfortable life, or am I called to do what God's called me to do? And maybe that is moving to a different state, like Mark was talking about, or to a different country. So I believe that God's called us as Christians to do what he's called us to do. Yeah. And so I think finding the purpose of God for your life is one of the most important things that you can ever do. And so I think living comfortable, Mark and I made that decision. No, we're not going to live comfortably. Yeah. And we're going to live dangerous. We're going to take that risk. We're going to be obedient. We're going to see all the promises of God fulfilled in our life. And so just to see the crazy thing about, you never know what's on the other side of your obedience. The people that we've seen on the other side of our obedience is just insane. Just to see the first couple I remember getting married in our church, like Mark and I just were weeping, like, oh my gosh. And then they had kids, and
so wild.
And then when you see families in your church being impacted, and people getting saved, and people getting set free, and the outreaches that you do, and so you never know. It takes one small step. Yep. That one small step leads to, I believe, when you listen to God, you find out the purpose of God, it leads to massive miracles. I agree. And so anyway, I love talking about all of that. Well, I want to ask you another question is, how do you steward, just church planning, or how do you steward that? How did we steward that? Raising up leaders. What did we do to steward church planning and that seed that God gave us?
Yeah, well, I think one of the probably biggest things we tried to do is we tried to learn from as many people as we could. You mentioned we went to ARC. We got trained from them. We watched your parents. You had a lifetime of experience in this world. So I think, if you want to be good at anything, you have to be a student of that thing. And so most people don't have empty churches because they're not teaching the truth. They don't love the Bible. It's they don't know the skill or the art of what does it take to actually build and to grow and to raise up leaders. And I think in many ways you have to always start with the end in mind. That's what we did.
Yeah.
And we go, okay, what do we feel God calling us to do? We felt like God gave us a dream, literally gave me a dream, that one day we'd have a major oceans church campus at every major ocean in the world with smaller campuses lining the coastlines. He told me in the dream that we'd have favor in coastal cities and port cities around the world. We wouldn't really focus on starting churches inland, but there'd be a favor on coastal cities. Yeah. And one day we'd have, an Indian Ocean's headquarters, an Atlantic Ocean's church headquarters, but we moved to California to start the flagship for the world, which would be Pacific Oceans Church. So I saw a lot of things in that dream in 2013 that I felt like God showed us in many ways where we're going to be towards the end of our life. And now we're kind of reverse engineering it of, okay, if you're going to have campuses all over the world, you better have a leadership factory.
That's right.
And how do you have a leadership factory? Well, you better have some sort of Bible college, leadership college, something of that nature. So we started Oceans College, I think, we were like 10 months old, 12 months old. We started the college,
right, yeah.
15 students. And we poured our very best into those 15 students. They spent 3 years with us. Those 15 finished about a year ago. And since then, we have about 100, I think we have 150 students signed up for September. And it's growing rapidly right now. And that is a factory, not just pastors and evangelists and prophets. It's going to be CEOs, executives. I mean, we already have some of those students have gone out, made millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And to see the fruit of that. So I think whenever you want to do something that you feel God's calling to you to long term, you look at where you're going. I call it bifocal leadership.
Yeah.
That you almost like bifocal glasses. You have a lens that's looking down way far away, 20 years, 30 years. And then you have another lens that you're looking at the immediate. And you're going, hey, what do I have to do today to take steps towards that? I think people that have big dreams without some sort of plan, strategy, and action, sweat, perspiring, working towards it, you don't have a dream, you have a fantasy. So I think ultimately God dreams require us to actually have a strategy, a plan, a system, a structure, and actually have someone that's willing to sweat to go after it. So I always tell our team that when we have a dream from God, it's not enough to have a dream. You actually have to say, Lord, now that I have the dream, what's the steps? And again, usually you start with the end in mind. You reverse engineer it. Okay, if we need to have leaders, what's our leadership factory?
So good.
If we need to have people that know how to have a competency with business, how do we gather business leaders? How do we pastor business people? And so a lot of what we're doing right now, I think people would go, well, God just must really like you guys. You guys must just be really, and I'm not denying that God has given us favor. 100% believe there's favor. Your parents gave their life to serve Jesus. You're walking in a generational blessing. My grandparents gave their whole life to the mission field, came back to America with no retirement. My grandpa drove buses in his 60s in downtown LA, and my grandma was a assistant at a executive assistant at a junior college. They lived off one of their incomes, saved the other income for 10 years so they could retire because they didn't have a dollar to their name after 30 years on the mission field. I believe that I'm stepping in that generational, blessing. But having said that, I don't think that what's happening here is just favor. I think it's not accidental.
Yes.
I think that there is a favor that God's given us, but I also think that we're stewarding that favor by actually having, Lord, you've given us a vision. Now we're asking every day, Lord, what do we do this week? What do we need to do in this season to get ready for the next season? What do we need to do today and this year so we're reaping the seeds? Most people don't like their harvest, but you can't change your harvest until you change your seeds. So I always tell people, if you don't like the harvest you have today, it's because of the seeds you sowed last year or in the last season of your life.
So good.
You can't reap good harvest now with bad seeds then. That's why I always tell people, if you're going to start a church, don't leave your church that you're at wrong. Because what will happen is whatever seed you come out of your church with will become the master seed of your church. And that's why guys that leave their churches and they dishonor their pastors and they divide the church, those guys start churches, and within 5-10 years, those churches self-implode because what they started in, that seed, is what they're reproducing in their church. If you have an Absalom spirit, you dishonor your leadership, one day Absalom's will be raised up in your house. I feel like we did everything to the best of our ability to go, God, we want to honor your mom and dad. We want to honor your brother, your sister-in-law. And they're still, very involved in our church, speak here on our board. And I think because we sowed the right seeds in the last season, we're reaping the benefit of that now.
And I think that's so important is honor, is the topic of honor, and how you leave one season is how you'll start and begin the next season.
And what you do to your leaders, one day your followers will do to you.
That's right. So good. So I think another question I'd like to ask you is, what one piece of advice do you wish we would have gotten when we started our church? What one piece of advice do you think, or do you wish you would have known before starting Oceans?
Oh, man. I would have said sleep more.
Sleep more, yeah.
I think we always joke that we like living, we go on vacation, we're like, all right, get ready, buckle up. We just landed back in Orange County. Here we go. It's like our life the last 5 years
has been a sprint.
It's been a sprint, It's a lot of work. It's a lot of energy. I don't know. I think people think, oh, it's balance. I don't think they're anywhere in the Bible that you talk about Jesus' ministry being balanced, the disciples' ministry being balanced. I think there's seasons, and I think we live in these stages that you have a crazy week that's just all consuming, and then you might have a day or two that's a lull, and then it's another crazy 4 days. And it's almost like you have to be good at just catching your breath. It's almost like being in a war.
Yeah.
When you're in a war, there's a firefight. Emergencies aren't planned.
Right.
You don't have these, you have a wave of momentum. It's not like, okay, we're just going to plan out how we're going to take naps, all throughout with this avalanche that's happening.
Yeah.
I think, when you're a farmer, you're in the field during harvest season. And then there's going to be that lull, right? That you sow the new round of seeds, you start watering it, and then you let the sun do its job. And I think for us, that's what we had to learn it's a lot of work. Yeah. Our brain is kind of always on. I tell people, if you want a 9-to-5 job that you can clock in, clock out, do not go into ministry.
Yeah.
We are not 9-to-5ers. We are more like emergency room doctors. You're always on call. Someone dies in someone's family. Someone goes through a tragedy, a hardship. Someone's, there's all kinds of things that will pull on you.
Yes.
That I didn't think that, Bible college didn't necessarily teach me. I'm teaching some of the lessons in our Bible college right now, what I didn't learn when I was taking Bible college. There's so many things I didn't know you had to learn. Real estate, HR, law. I'm like, there's things, I didn't know I'm dealing with lawsuits, legal disputes. I'm like, I had no idea some of the things that we'd have to figure out along this way. But it's a lot of work. But my grandma used to always say, the call of God, it's a lot of work. The pay isn't the best. The hours are long. The respect isn't always there. But the bumper sticker said, but the retirement package, it's out of this world.
Oh,
so it's my grandma's.
So cute.
It was her bumper sticker.
I loved your grandma. Grandma Billy, she was amazing. She was an incredible preacher. I remember when she came to our youth ministry, what did she say? We had, youth ministry is so loud. And the music was really loud, and Mark and I led.
She was going to speak that night.
She was going to speak that night, and Mark is bringing her into the service, and it's super, super loud. And what did you ask your grandma?
I said, Grandma, let's wait. The music's almost over. It's really loud in there. We'll go in there after the music's over.
Yeah.
And she looked at me. She said, son, my grandma raised me at Azusa Street. We're going in. That's just my grandma. She was a firecracker.
Oh, I loved her so much. I miss her. So as a family with kids, being in ministry, I grew up as a pastor's kid or a PK. Shout out to any of you pastor's kids listening. I told myself as a young kid that I didn't want to go into ministry, and even into our early dating. And I said, promise me that I don't think I asked you to promise, but I said, we are not going to start a church or plan a church, because I saw all that my parents went through, and they went through a lot of hard things. And so as a pastor's kid, being raised in church all my life, to see us now stepping into, church planning, pastors again. And I learned so much as a kid. And now we have our 2 young girls, as pastors' kids, and they're being raised in the house of God. And what are things that are the challenges that we faced when we first moved here with our girls? Do you think was one of the most?
Yeah, that was a tough season.
Yeah, it was really.
Our
tough.
little one, she was 3.
She was great.
Yeah, she was fine. But our oldest daughter was 10. She was super close to your parents, my parents. All of her cousins lived within 10 minutes.
Yeah.
We go to your parents' house. Your dad was like her school teacher, helped her out with their homework every day.
Her bestie, yeah.
And so I remember we knew that going in, and we had other friends that had started churches away from where they were at, and they knew that, hey, this is going to be really tough for your kids the first year, especially the first year. And so I remember that first year, our oldest daughter, Kenzie, she had a picture of your mom and dad on her pillow. She kept it under her pillow at night. She'd cry herself to sleep.
Yeah.
And I remember that we knew it was going to be hard, but that was a really tough season.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those things you can't get around it. And one of the things that motivated us to move, though, was when we had that conversation, is the purpose of life comfort? We answered no. I remember you said, Mark, I think that, listen, not only do we have to move to California for us, but if God made us to go to California to pastor, that means our daughter's destiny is in California too.
Yeah.
Remember you said that, I'm like, oh my gosh, what if Kenzie and Chloe's husbands and their destiny is all in Orange County, and we're just gonna play it safe. We're gonna sit back and coast. We were basically big fish in a small pond in Idaho, and we're just gonna take it easy the next 40 years of our life. And we're like, what if we screw our kids up? Because our calling sets our kids up for what they're gonna do next. So I think we knew that was true. And I think we also knew that it was going to be probably a year or two that, our oldest daughter probably is going to like us very much in that area. But one day she would come to us and say, Mom, Dad, thank you. Even though it was crazy hard and scary and difficult, thank you for moving. And now that's where we're at. Our daughters love Idaho. They love visiting your family, and we love going up there in the summers. But even Kenzie goes, Dad, I love Idaho, but I could never live there again. I'm a California girl. So it's cool to see the other side, even though it was painful that first year or two.
Yeah. Yeah, that was pretty difficult as parents, seeing your oldest especially go through just hard times and through the difficulty of moving and transitioning. And it's really cool now that she has such incredible friends, godly friends in the church, and she loves California. And obviously
she's so Orange County too.
Yeah,
she's like her mama.
She definitely is. And but it's cool to see what God's doing in and through her life. And it was really cool the other day at a prayer meeting. God just spoke to her in our prayer meeting at our church, and that was really cool. God gave her a vision of her life, and so that was amazing to see what God's doing in and through our girls. But I think what would be a common misconception of planning churches, do you think? If somebody asked, what would you say is a common misconception?
Well, I would say that the one negative side effect of church planning becoming more popular is, I think, misconception is it's a normal vocation. I think starting a church, being a lead pastor, is not just something that you choose. It chooses you. I don't think that you choose it. So some guys are like, oh, it'll just be easy, It always cracks me up when people get mad about pastors that have money.
Yeah.
And they're like, what do you think about Joel Osteen and all these pastors that are wealthy? I'm like, if you figured out a way to be a millionaire in ministry, you'd probably be a billionaire if you didn't go into ministry. Like the idea that people choose ministry to get rich is like, it's like making the lottery like your success plan for the future. Like, I'm not going to go to school. I'm just going to buy a lottery ticket when I'm 21 and I'm going to be rich. Like, there's a very low percentage. I mean, out of all the people in the body of Christ that write books, that do well, it's very small percentage of people that do that. So I think, number one, it's not a normal calling. I think it's a call by God. And I actually think there's a lot of people that are really frustrated with ministry. They're struggling financially. They're struggling in their church. They don't have enough money to pay their bills. And what happens is their kids grow up and they hate the church because my mom and dad gave everything, and the church didn't take care of my parents.
Right.
My grandma used to always say this. She said, Mark, there's a lot of miserable preachers because they're called to be farmers. And there's a lot of miserable farmers because they're called to be preachers. I personally believe that when God calls you to do something, there's going to be a favor. There's going to be a grace. I'm not saying you're going to be a mega church pastor. I'm saying there's going to be fruitfulness.
Yes.
That's going to take care of you and your family. Yeah. I've pastored a lot of pastors' kids when I was a youth pastor even that had a bunch of trauma because mom and dad gave everything to the ministry, but they suffered. And I just think maybe your mom and dad, in a very, very nice way, I'm like, maybe your mom and dad had a pure heart to serve God, but maybe that's not what he wanted them to do. Because I think ultimately, I would never try to go on The Voice like my friend Bodie and be a singer if I don't have a grace to sing.
Definitely don't.
That hurts. No, I wouldn't try to go into the NFL.
Yeah.
And look, I'm a Laker fan. I put a Laker jersey on, I show up and I say, guys, I promise tonight I'm going to be the best Laker you've ever seen. Yeah. What you promise doesn't matter based upon your skill set and what your preparation is.
So good.
And I think many people think they can go into ministry and say, God, I promise I'm going to give you my best and you're going to bless me. Promises are no match for preparation.
So good.
And I think that there should be a grace on your life. And I would even tell you, if you feel called to be a lead pastor, if you're serving in a role at a church as a kids pastor, youth pastor, young adult pastor, if you can't steward that well and there's not fruitfulness in that ministry, I would save you a lot of heartache and say, don't think that starting your own church is going to make it easier for you to succeed. I remember telling some of our staff, if you can't grow a junior high ministry, how do you think there'd be a grace to actually disciple and raise up all of the youth ages? If you can't raise up a youth ministry, what makes you think that you could do a campus? You could be a campus pastor. So I think the proof is in the pudding. If there's a grace in what you're doing at a small scale, there's probably a grace at a larger scale. But there's a lot of people that think that being a pastor and starting a church is like choosing to be a CPA or a school teacher. Those are great trades, great professions, but it's not like choosing to be an electrician. You want to be a pastor. You don't just have the wind of trying to pay your bills against you and trying to build a business. You have the wind of hell blowing in your face.
Right.
That's what's different. Most business people don't realize that. You start a business, the devil doesn't like you, but you start a church and it's like you are building the very thing that destroys the kingdom of darkness. So there's another level of, I think, opposition that we face that most people don't face. So I would say you need to be called. It's not a good idea. It has to be a God idea. And I also think that you need to make sure you have a grace, that you actually have people that are covering you. We had your parents, obviously. We were sent. You don't want the story to be they went. Yeah. You want the story to be they were sent.
That's good.
Went and sent are totally different things.
That's right.
If you're starting a church, I don't want to went. I want to be sent.
So good.
And so make sure you have that in your I guess behind you, the momentum.
That's so powerful. That's so good. So when it comes to building teams and team culture, and what I know for me, when we were first building teams and culture and all of that, you have to become who you want to produce. So I know that for me, we wanted a worship culture at our church. We wanted a praying culture. And so I remember the first couple Sundays at our church, we were at Kappa Valley. It was a theater, and I wanted a worship culture. So
the crazy blonde lady in the front row.
Yes, that's exactly what happened.
Out of control.
Yes. So basically, I was worshiping, and I was trying to teach our team because we barely know our team, right? Well, we're getting to know them, creating that community. And I remember, I'm like, I'm going to become what I want our team and our culture to become. Yeah. And so I began to worship, and I was lifting both hands, and I was like really going at it. And
which is crazy in Orange County.
Yeah, crazy because it's like coffee style vibe.
The latte, just kind of checking the concert out.
Yeah, they like stare at the musicians and the worship team like, what do you got for me today? And so I was like, that's not going to be our vibe or our culture at our team. So I was giving my all in worship, and then we had a guy who was helping, I think, Nathaniel and Pastor Joel at the time, and sound at the school. He was part of the school helping us.
And you're saying amen.
And I was saying amen, and I wanted to be vocal as well because I wanted our church to be vocal. So he was like, I don't know if he told Nathaniel or Pastor Joel, he's like, who's the crazy lady in the front row? And they told me that afterwards. I just died laughing. Yeah. I'm like, well, I'm good. I'm glad that I did my job. And then, a few weeks later, maybe a month or 2 months later, I'm looking, because nobody worshiped, really.
No one lifted their hands.
No one lifted their hands.
No one's really clapping hardly.
No.
Yeah.
And so I look back and I'm like, oh, they're worshiping.
They're
catching it. So you have to become what you want your team to become, and you have to model it first. And so Mark and I are really big on modeling things and creating culture. And so what would, as we end the show, what would be some things that you think that are good things that we could model to build really good team culture?
Yeah, well, I think it'd be good to maybe just practical exercise, sit down. We did this in the early days of our even youth pastors. And we said, if someone was to explain or describe someone that went to Oceans Church, what would they say about us? You must go to Oceans Church because you're so, what? Worshipful.
Yeah.
Because you're so faith-filled. Because you believe that God does miracles. You prayed for sick people. Man, because you're so evangelistic, you're sharing your faith with everybody. Because you're such a great leader. Because you're such a hard worker. You're so excellent. So we kind of wrote down all of these description words of what would someone define our people, us. What would they define us as? We wrote a list down. There's probably maybe 100 things we wrote down, different qualities. And I remember after we did that, we essentially we condensed all those things into maybe 12 different categories, and those became the things that we would teach on. Those would be the things that we'd be very intentional about. And I think the first question every leader has to ask is, if you're frustrated in the absence of a trait that's in your organization, when you look in the mirror, is it there? Because if you look in the mirror and you're like, man, I'm ticked off that no one's generous in our church, and you look in the mirror and you're like, you're not generous. Why would your church? I think that's funny. Our church is a generous church, and I have friends that even pastor in Orange County, and they're like, how in the world? People go, well, you're just in a wealthy area. I have a lot of friends that pastor in Orange County. Their churches are struggling. So I don't think that our church is a reflection of just where we live. I think our church takes on the culture of the staff, of the leaders. And I think because me and you, we made up our mind, we were young, we're going to live above and beyond. We're going to be generous givers, not just tithers or tippers. We're going to go above and beyond that. And every year we try to add 1% to our giving. So I think because me and you, that's who we are. I think that our team caught that, staff caught that, and now the church has caught that. And we are a generous church. And so I think you look no further than the mirror when you're irritated and go, hey, where is this? Why isn't anybody excited? How come no one knows how to pray? How come no one's faith-filled? How come everyone's just discouraged? Is that in you? And I think the good news is this: when you look in the mirror and you're frustrated at what's not there, you're always one conversation with God away from getting to that place. And you say, Holy Spirit, forgive me for being cynical or critical or jaded. Forgive me for doubting you. Today, give me great faith. Because I want the people that you've entrusted to my care to carry great faith. So Lord, get any doubt out of me. So when I get around other people, I'm contagious in the area that, God, you want me to be strong in. So I think you can make excuses or you can make changes, but you can't do both. So it's always good to make changes, not excuses, when you're in leadership roles.
It's so good. So as we end the show, I think this would be something so powerful to share. What you shared in our staff meeting the other day with Hagar and Ishmael, I think you talked about the water in the well. I thought that was so profound, what you shared. And I think it would be beautiful for you to share it for just any church planners as well.
Yeah, there's a story in, I think it's Genesis 21, about Ishmael's mom, Hagar. And she essentially gets sent out. She gets kicked out of their house. She's obviously the mother of the son that's not going to be the heir. And so they go out with a bunch of water. They run out of water somewhere in the desert. And I don't know if you've ever contextualized, told her staff that, I don't know if you've ever contextualized what it would feel like to live in the pages of Scripture. But I think that's got to be one of the worst stories to think about, is you're a parent, you run out of water, you're in a desert, and you know that death is imminent. You know that this is the end. I'm going to die. My kid's going to die. I don't think there's a worse thought for a parent to know that we're done. And just think about where you'd be emotionally. And it says that Hagar sets her son under a bush. She goes about a bow's shot away from her son. I can imagine, because she doesn't want to. It says that she didn't want to see her son die. So she's 100 yards away. She's weeping uncontrollably. The baby's crying out loud, desperate situation, probably the worst case scenario. And it's interesting because the story says that she's crying, baby's crying, and all of a sudden this angel hears the baby. God sends an angel, says, Hagar, don't be afraid. God makes a promise to her that you're going to live. And it says after that the angel, God heard the baby crying. It's a weird verse in verse 19 or something. It says that after she cried out to God and after God gave her the promise that there's a future, it says God opened her eyes and she saw a well. And I just remember when I read that the other day, I'm like, that's such a goofy, like, you would think that if you're dying of thirst, priority number one would be, is there a well in a 100-mile radius? How in the world did you not see a well that was there when you were at the brink of dying of dehydration? And I thought, well, it's only two explanations. One, God magically made a well appear out of nowhere. Or two, it was there the whole time, but she couldn't see it because her eyes were so full of tears. Her emotional condition was so over, she had tapped out, that she gave up. And because of her mentality and because of her emotional condition, she was blinded by the reality of what was actually in front of her. And I just told our staff this, what I've learned in church planning is that when you feel like there's no way, there's always a well. And I think that when we cry out to God, it is in prayer that God, I think, gives us the visibility to see the wells that have been there all along.
So good.
So I think that many people, they die saying that, God, why would you let me die of thirst? And God says, there was a well there, but you just never saw it because you never cried out to me. So I think that when we cry out to God, Lord, show me the water. Show me the water, Jerry. We ask God to show us the water, and I think that God will show us the well. So where there's no way, there's a well. That's what I told our staff.
So good. Well, I think that's a great way to end the show. Could you, Pastor Mark, could you pray for maybe some of those that are going to start a church or they're thinking about it or they're praying about it? Could you just pray for them that God would just begin to show them the region, the city, or God would give them divine strategies from heaven, and that God would open up their eyes to see that well and see the way that God's called them.
Do I go eyes closed in that prayer, or do I look at the camera like the TVN? And
No, eyes closed, okay. Eyes closed.
Lord, we just want to say that we love you. We're so grateful that the greatest maybe evangelistic tool on the earth is when you send a man and a woman into a city to start a new church. We believe that God Church, the local church, is the hope of the world when it's done right. And we believe that, God, you're coming back, not for random, rogue, Rambo Christians, but you're coming back, God, for your bride. We ask you, Lord, to remind us that, God, that the end of the age is not going to be a rescue mission to get the church out of a bad condition. It's going to be a wedding of a beautiful bride that's without spot, without wrinkle, that's more glorious than the church that Jesus died to leave us. So I thank you that you said that the harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few. Therefore, pray to the Lord of the harvest to raise up the laborers. I ask you today, Father, that you would call, that you would raise up the next generation of great church leaders, church planters. And I think that not everybody has to start a church. There's going to be a big transfer of some of the great ministries that are built already. That, God, there's going to be a new generation that comes in and leads churches that they didn't build, that takes over venues that they didn't have to raise money for. And so I ask you, Lord, that whether it's a plant from the scratch or whether it's a takeover, a baton passing, that you would raise up the next generation that have fire, that have wisdom, that would be called, that have conviction, but also have integrity and honor. Father, I just pray you'd raise up the next great generation of church leaders. We bless them today. Give them great success. Let the cloud lead them by day. Let your fire lead them by night. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I love you. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Thank you for coming. It was all so profound and so good. And so we'll see you in a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Collective Talk, where we shared everything about church planning. Stay tuned for future episodes as we explore topics on prayer, family, and ministry.